On my presentation on the experience on the supply chain posed by COVID-19 and lessons learned for the future, I focused more on the transportation sector, which is a component of supply chain. Because as we all know, when there is a disruption in the supply chain, invariably the transport sector will be affected. On the presentation, I've just defined the supply chain into saying that it's a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product or service. And the entities in the supply chain includes producers, vendors, warehouses, transportation companies, distribution centers, and retailers. So going into COVID-19, COVID-19 has challenged transportation professionals to quickly adapt to a dramatically altered logistics landscapes that we are not used to. The pandemic has disrupted the supply chain, imposed remote work on all but essential workers, and completely unattended executive priorities. The pandemic has also shown that manufacturing and logistics industry, the dangers of just-in-time one source supply chain management. There were a lot of intermittent delays that we really experienced during the advent of COVID. In the transporting sector, our employees, or rather predominantly drivers, were looked at people who will be at the highest risk of transporting the virus into different countries because they were traveling across the region. So as a result, when they were crossing into each and every country, they will be put in a certain place. They will have to undergo COVID testing and wait for the results. So those intermittent delays have actually affected our optimal vehicle utilization and turnaround, and impacted financially on us because the more you turn around, the more you generate revenue. And on the negative aspect of it, it increased our wages that we pay out, because as our drivers are standing there in one place waiting for the result for 5 to 6 hours, they end up earning more overtime that we are forced to pay because it's not their fault. Let's move on to the next slide. Next slide, Mr. Midupi. We have also witnessed the ever-changing and dynamic need for a fluid transportation system that can be as efficient, whilst also adhering to various national legislation. We all know there were lockdowns across the country and neighboring countries. We all know there were zonal permits restrictions. Our drivers were also expected to have permits every now and then, which posed a serious challenge on us as transporters in terms of planning. This was witnessed in numerous national cross-border entry requirements in the form of the 72-hour PCR test, as I've already alluded to, and the need for self-isolation upon entry. What actually transpired is that we were forced into a very unfamiliar working operation, whereby we were restricted to have one driver only working for 14 days. And then after 14 days, that driver has to be taken to quarantine for another 10 days. That created a shortage as well into our operation, which forced us to park some of our vehicles. Let's move into another slide. This alone proved to turn the entire transport operation on its head, given the extreme downtime in waiting for the result and in the security of trip completion, given the status of the pending COVID-19 results. We found in this period a company resorting to working from home and stressing the need to have minimal interaction with the transport operators, given their exposure to ever-changing COVID-19 virus. Because our drivers were deemed, instead of transporting product, now they were deemed, seen as the transporter of the virus. So other suppliers resorted to avoid coming close contact with our drivers, and some of them closed their manufacturing. During this virus waves of the COVID-19, where national lockdowns were imposed, transport across various sectors were hugely affected, with operation restricted to being just daytime operations and not 24-hour operations as curfews were instated. With the easing on restrictions globally, we see a gradual improvement in the transport sector of both the essential services and commercial transport as things go back to normal. Lessons learned in conclusion. The lessons that needs to be learned is that we can't assume supplies will always be there if we don't treat them well during difficult times. Even the smallest vendors demand a new level of respect. How you nurture and respect every partnership with the supply chain makes a huge difference. COVID-19 pandemic have shown us that we can no longer think about the supply chain the way we used to. So it's imperative that we really have to transform the pain of that experience into new ways of thinking about and acting on relationship in our complex global supply chains. Relationships involves also looking at the contracts that will compensate the losses that would have been incurred during the pandemic. Because the drivers were not being tested for free. There was a fee that had to be paid for them to be tested. And it was never recovered from anyone because contractually the suppliers could not afford to absorb that cost. Simply put, it is imperative that we bear towards a more resilient relationship, as the other panelists had already alluded to. So I think basically from the transportation sector, that is how we have been impacted during the pandemic.